We're going to shift for the next workshop to talk about protected areas. I think a lot of people that are here around the table today are really interested in the concept of protected areas. And I think we've been talking about structure and that sort of thing. And I think one of the important things is what we can do by working together. And I think protected areas really represent something that we can, the sorts of conversations we can have that can help, that cross the jurisdictions, that this sort of meeting can be really productive for. We're really happy Oceans North is here, is going to lead the workshop on protected areas. It's really great that Oceans North has now been really working to expand to this side of Hudson Bay. So I think we're all really happy about that and really appreciate that they also helped sponsor this meeting. So that's really appreciated. So I'm going to hand it over to Jenny and Caitlin to talk about protected areas.
Hi everyone, good morning. I just wanted to take a moment to introduce myself. I was ill yesterday morning. So my name's Caitlin Breton-Honeyman, and I work with the Nunavik Marine Region Wildlife Board in Inukjuak. And we're here to kind of co-facilitate this workshop on protected areas together with Oceans North Canada. So I'll turn it over to Jenny for the introductory part.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jenny Knopp. I work for Oceans North Canada, and we just want to take a brief moment to introduce Oceans North to you, because I'm not sure how many people around the table are aware of the type of work that we do. We're a non-government organization. We've been around for approximately 8 years. We have projects on the go in all 4 of the Inuit regions, as well as in the estuaries near Churchill in Manitoba. And we're also interested in working further in the areas of southern Hudson Bay and James Bay. We have some principles that we follow within our work. One of our main goals is to ensure that the government's commitment to protect 10% of Canada's oceans by 2020 has proportionate representation in the Arctic. We only work within land claims and areas identified by Inuit as important for marine protection. And we propose that marine protected areas are near communities to maximize traditional harvest and use, and to create conservation jobs for community members for monitoring and management of protected areas. And just to tie into some of the things we were talking about yesterday, we are working on a project near Churchill. The area that is highlighted in the yellow stripes is an area of high beluga density. And so we've been working with Arviat hunters and Fisheries and Oceans Canada, as well as others, to identify a high density habitat of beluga and protect estuary habitat in Manitoba. We also worked on cultural sites in the same area with the Inuit and Dene, and this project showed that indeed this area was an important historical cultural area. And this project actually, for the first time, got Manitoba to adopt a beluga habitat management plan that recognizes the importance of beluga to Nunavut communities. So we're looking at working between Manitoba and Nunavut. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on us. If you have any more questions about our organization, please feel free to approach myself or Chris, who's almost directly across from me, at any time during our gathering here. And so we're talking about marine protected areas planning across jurisdictions. And some people brought up in the previous session the concept of each land claim having to deal with their own rules and legislation and provisions within the land claim, and making decisions and having representatives, elected representatives, make those decisions. And so the interesting thing about marine protected areas is that they can link these overlapping areas of land claims, or that they can extend from partly within a land claim to outside of a land claim. And so it might be an area where there can be overlap and working together. So I'm going to actually read this quote so that the translators can translate for the people listening on the earphones. In September 2015, the Trudeau government announced a plan to protect Canada's oceans. And they said a liberal government will meet Canada's international commitments by increasing the amount of our protected marine and coastal areas from 1.3% to 5% by 2017, which is now next year, and 10% by 2020. Reinstate 40 million cut from the federal government's ocean science and monitoring programs and restore scientific capabilities at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and work with provinces, Indigenous peoples, and other stakeholders to effectively co-manage the oceans. Now, this is the Trudeau-Obama joint statement, and after last night's events, I'm not sure if this will still hold true, but it was a statement made, so I'd like to share this also. This statement was made in March 2016, and it was the US-Canada Joint Statement on Climate, Energy, and Arctic Leadership. And it was under the topic of a shared Arctic leadership model. So conserving Arctic biodiversity through science-based decision-making, Canada and the US reaffirm our national goals of protecting at least 17% of land and 10% of marine areas by 2020. We will take concrete steps to achieve and sustainably surpass these national goals in coming years. Specifically, we will work directly with Indigenous partners, state, territorial, and provincial governments to establish this year a new ambitious conservation goal for Arctic based on the best available climate science and knowledge, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike. We will also play a leadership role in engaging all Arctic nations to develop a pan-Arctic marine protection area network. So I'm just providing this as a bit of overview and background as to some of the statements the governments have made in terms of Arctic marine conservation. And hopefully you can see this map behind me. I'm not sure who's changing the slides over there, but maybe, oh, thank you. It's a bit hard to see, but the point of this map is there's a lot of green, which represents terrestrial protection, and very little navy blue, which represents marine protection in Canada. There's several different jurisdictions within the legislative structure of Canada that deal with marine protection. There's a sheet being passed around that looks like this. There's about 80 English copies and 40 in Nunavut syllabics. We just created this table a few weeks ago, so I sincerely apologize that we did not get it translated to Cree or Nunavut syllabics. We tried to, but we didn't have enough time. So if this is something that is useful for people to use within their organizations, we're still willing to have it translated for you, and we can send you the copy. So this graph relates to this table, which I'll discuss shortly. This just shows you the different areas within the government that are working on marine protection. As you can see, Environment and Climate Change Canada have the most land mass that they're dealing with in terms of protection. And trends in protection in Canada since 1990 up to last year, it's just showing that since this time, since 1990, terrestrial protection has increased significantly, whereas marine protection hasn't really had much going on. But just to point out again that terrestrial protection is only up near, I think it's 11.5%, whereas marine protection is at about 1.7% of landmass or ocean mass. Okay, so we're to this table, and I won't go through it in detail because you have a copy in front of you, I hope. It's coming around the table. If you don't have one, maybe find the pile. I think it's down there. I'll just quickly point out some of the different types of marine protection that are currently existing in Canada. So Fisheries and Oceans has something that they call marine protected areas. You heard Cal Winghofer speak about this yesterday. There's also a fishing closure that has happened in the Beaufort Sea, which is done through Fisheries and Oceans and the land claim. So Environment and Climate Change Canada has both national wildlife areas and migratory bird sanctuaries that can extend into the marine environment. Parks Canada has national marine conservation and historical site options for marine protection. And at the bottom on the slide or the piece of paper that's being handed out, there's 2 rows in yellow. And so there are provisions within each of the Indigenous land claims that allow for specific types of marine protection. And there's also something being proposed by Mary Simon, who's the ministerial special representative to the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs, who's working on the shared Arctic leadership model. She's been discussing and proposing an Indigenous protected area. And this is something that is coming from her tours to the communities, and it's a concept of a bottom-up approach where communities and Indigenous organizations can promote and propose their own protected areas as opposed to working within some of the structures that already exist. It's not final yet, it's just something that's being discussed, but I just wanted to bring it to people's attention. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time talking because this is supposed to be a group discussion. We just wanted to provide some information to bring everybody on the same page and give some overview about marine protection in Canada. And we've also put maps up on the walls, you'll see. There's 2 different maps, there's 4 of each in case people decide they want to write a lot on them. The purpose of these maps is to provide a visual component to the discussion that we're having. Please feel free to write anything that you like on them, correct them if there's mistakes. There's markers all along the bottom. If you do circle something for any particular reason, it might be that there's eelgrass there, or that you think it's an important area to protect, or that you'd like to discuss something going on there between Cree and Inuit, please write why you've circled that area. These maps will be given to the decision makers around the table for their use in future discussions. So I'll pass it over to Caitlin, who's going to chair the discussion. Do we have time? Okay, sorry, before I pass it over, we weren't sure how much time we had. I'd like to ask Hal to speak to some of the steps that are taken to get towards an MPA, and he can speak to examples within the Inuvialuit settlement region. So Cal, if you could just take a few minutes, and actually I think there's somebody who wants to say something first.
Yes, thank you. There's a protected area designation in where I live, in a cliff area. You see the northern Quebec, like the north, province of mountains. It's not Provenito, that's Akhluvik. I'm sorry you have the name wrong. We tried to correct that with KRG one time, and it's still POV, Province of Mountains. I'm sorry to tell you it's not.
Please don't be sorry. Thank you, Henry, and that's why they're up there. And please take the marker and fix that so it can be corrected when we do the final printing.
If the name is going to stay like that, we want you to move it to POV.
Okay, Cal, if you wouldn't mind sharing your knowledge.
Sure. And as I mentioned yesterday, to date anyways, the majority of our work has been in the Inuvialuit settlement region, and the land claim is a Inuvialuit final agreement that we work with our Inuvialuit partners to develop marine protected areas. And as I mentioned, we have one that's been in place since 2010, and one that will be officially designated very, very soon. So I won't go into any real depth or detail, Jenny, in terms of the steps. Maybe I'll stick to some of the high points. But I'll start off by saying that the process that we have used to date in working with the Inuvialuit, as well as other partners, the first MPA that was developed in the Mackenzie Estuary was a collaborative effort between the Inuvialuit, the federal government, and industry was also involved, because at the time there was a lot of oil and gas interests in the region as well. But the process that goes forward, the Inuvialuit Game Council, the Hunters and Trappers Committees, the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, and all the land claim bodies are part of a committee that's brought together to discuss where marine protected areas might be considered and ultimately put in place. So again, it's a very collaborative model, and that committee would typically get together well before there was ever any decisions made with respect to an area of interest for a marine protected area. So in the Inuvialuit settlement region, this group would sit down, gather the information, socioeconomic, traditional knowledge, ecological, and really do a screening of the available information for the region. One of the advantages that we have in this area is very similar to what is being discussed here over the next over these 2 days. There's what we call an integrated management initiative in this region that is again a partnership with the Inuvialuit and the federal government, as well as the Yukon and NWT territorial governments. And a lot of work has gone into pulling together ecological information, identification of significant areas. And in fact, we have a number of working groups that are within the governance structure of this partnership that do that sort of work. And we also have a traditional knowledge working group that works to assist in moving this and bringing information together. So in those initial stages, it's really about gathering information and trying to identify where we might be looking to establish protection. As an area of interest, and that's what we call it, as an area of interest is identified through that process. It's then where it sort of becomes a more formal process, and where there's ecological overviews are done of the area. There's socioeconomic overviews. There's a resource overview, so what resources might be in the area. And we also, again, with the traditional knowledge working group, bring in the traditional knowledge component. There's one point of that in terms of this next, the Anganikikium marine protected area that will be designated soon. One of the areas, it really has two aspects to it, a northern aspect and a southern aspect. It's on the Parry Peninsula on the east side. And the southern portion of that, the objectives related to char, in fact, were based on traditional knowledge that was brought to the committee from the working group from elders. And so again, that's a very strong component of the work that has gone on there in the past for both of these MPAs. So again, it's pulling that, the initial stages is really pulling together all that information, preparing those reports. It's from there that, and just a step back, consultations, I almost don't say that because it's such an integral part of all of this. So while we do have the committees that, or the committee that is doing much of the work, there's 6 communities in this region, and depending on what areas are being looked at, the communities are involved in every step of the way. So for Tarium, it was Aklavik, Tuktoyaktuk, and Inuvik, and for this next MPA, it was the community of Paulatuk, and the community members are also on these committees. And that's right from the beginning of or as it's initiated, right up until the management and developing the management plans and taking part in the management. So I just want to make sure that I say that and cover that off. So after all the information is gathered around an area of interest, it's really, the consultations are key because you're developing the regulatory intent. And I just got the hurry up motion, so I'll go through this a little quicker. Developing the regulatory intent, working with all the partners around the table in terms of what would be prohibited and what would be or what would not be prohibited. and coming to agreement on that, as well as the boundary of the area, the ultimate boundary of the area. And again, that's really based on traditional knowledge and science being brought together. And after we have that agreement at the regional level, then obviously there's a regulatory phase that has to happen through the Oceans Act. It's regulations developed under the Oceans Act. So all of that, and I mentioned that yesterday, depending on the issues and how consultations go, it can be a fairly lengthy process. Our first one was about 10 years, and we're sort of narrowing that down as we go. But that's been our experience, and would be happy if anybody wants to discuss in further detail sort of our experiences. I'd be more than happy to talk about them.
Thanks, Cal. So now I think everybody probably has the table that was passed around, and just to be clear, so there's different types of marine protected areas, as Jenny mentioned, and the type of protected area that Cal was talking about is the capitalized MPA, which is a DFO, process, but there's lots of other ways of going about protected areas. And also just to let you know that on the back of that table, there's also a list of examples of protected areas in the marine region in Canada, in northern Canada. So really just to reiterate, this is meant to kind of open up discussions around protected areas. Some things that you might want to consider talking about is ideas of how protected area planning should be done. What do people around the table see protected areas, what their role is, what they could be for communities? Updates from different jurisdictions about where these conversations are at in the respective regions, I think would be really interesting and helpful for other people to hear about. I'm sure that depending on where you're from, that conversation's at a different stage, and I think we could probably learn a lot from hearing from people who are further ahead in the process and what stumbling blocks they've come to and how they've addressed those challenges in terms of getting protected areas approved. And really it's an opportunity to learn from each other about protected areas. So out of curiosity, by a show of hands, who around the room has had some level of involvement in protected area planning in some capacity? Okay, so it sounds like not very many of us. And I think lots of us are starting to think about it. I know, Jenny mentioned how it's become a priority for the federal government, and that's really kind of increasing the level of focus on protected areas. And I know from our end that it's a conversation that we're starting to have with communities, and maybe Michelle will speak to the workshop that was hosted in May on protected areas in the NMR, in the Nunavik Marine Region, and we're planning to take similar maps that are up on the wall to Saluit, to the annual ARNC meeting next week, in order to start having conversations about which areas people would like to see focused on. But really, this is just an opportunity to start these conversations and to hear from each other and to learn. So we'll open the floor to questions, comments, anything that people want to share. Chalmik.
Okay, I want to put in 2 points. First one is considering the polar bear as a marine mammal. and also considering the expansion of the protected areas to be established in the future, I am still saying that Ottawa Islands should be protected for being polar bear habitat. That is where our polar bears are coming from. When expansion times comes in, I would want Ottawa Islands to be included. That's the first point. Second point is there is also a protected area for belugas in Nastapoka River, Little Well River, for the protection of their habitat. But protecting the area is only focused into Inuit hunters. The considerable damage has been made to those rivers by Hydro-Quebec, and I have never heard or known that Hydro-Quebec is being approached to correct the damages that has been made. I would, to ensure the proper protection to protect the beluga, I say Hydro-Quebec complex, Le Grand complex, should be demolished or dismantled. Thank you.
Nakumikshaumik. And I think those are some great points. The Little Whale River and Nastapoka, as you pointed out, they're closed they're sanctuaries under the under the marine mammal regulations, which is a completely separate process. So I think talking about them in this forum as protected areas for the habitat is a really valuable contribution. Eli?
I guess, thank you, Caitlin. I guess it's about time I speak. I haven't spoken since my introduction. In terms of educating your thick skulls, you guys from Canada, DFO, and your university degree PhDs, you still haven't learned that traditional knowledge is very important. Local knowledge is important. I want to set an example on Franklin expedition where they perished because they didn't gather any traditional knowledge and ended up dying. And there was this guy, Amundsen. He succeeded passing through the Northwest Passage. He was with Inuit for 3 years, I think, and he succeeded using those traditional knowledge. So there is a history that needs to be learned, that traditional knowledge is could be helpful, useful, but yet to this day, the traditional knowledge and local knowledge is still neglected by the scientists and also by universities. To this day, the real Inuit who were out on the land are diminishing. We're more urbanized and has less knowledge than those people who were out on the land and knows the land and the waters. these people needs to be prioritized and be researched somehow and put into hard copies so that their knowledge could be handed down to the researchers. In terms of prioritizing the research, I'm suggesting that these real hunters that are slowly diminishing should be priority to the researchers. I am saying that traditional knowledge is the key to all the future research projects. And Lucas mentioned that he was just waiting for someone somewhere, that there'll be some guy coming in to do a research, but he told us that instead of just waiting, the local people should get some kind of resources, financial resources, to do their traditional knowledge. And these institutions who give handouts, research handouts, are still neglecting the Inuit. For example, we plead with DFO to do aerial survey on the seal population, but they just opted to neglect us, and instead they wanted to do bowhead research instead. So the people that has financial resources should at least put some money aside for local Inuit to do their own research. Maybe that should be looked at, because we have a lot of knowledge. There's even prophecies that were already told, that our land someday will never get to be winter. I mean, it's already been foretold that there'll be no more winter, and also that our Arctic char, our main diet, will not be edible no more. It's been foretold, and that will happen in the future. And also the polar bears, the walrus have been foretold that they would come back to our shores in Hudson Bay. And it's already been foretold that caribous will not come back again once they are vanished. That's been foretold. These things, these traditional knowledge which we have are being still neglected. And I'm suggesting that in order to get good information on how the research would go on, I would suggest that the traditional knowledge be researched, at least in our area, so that you will have a good information and how things will happen in the future. Nakomik, did I make any sense?
Hello, friends. Before next one, someone else speak. Can we try to stick to the point to talk about protected areas, please?
Michelle?
Ulakut, good morning. Ulakut, Wacha. I'm Michelle Nasir. I'm from the Regional Planner for the Nunavik Marine Region Planning Commission, and I also work for the Impact Review Board. And in lieu of what Lucasy is saying, I just wanted to give an update to people who weren't there yesterday or missed our presentation. We had just one slide up, but we did mention that for protected areas at least, we did host a preliminary workshop in Montreal on May 19th of this year, where we did have some participation from the communities. Mostly it was through the Nunavik Landholding Corporation, the Nunavik Landholding Association, as well as from members of the RNUC and the LNUC and the HFTA were present. But we'd also like to see more, and what we're doing right now is we're trying to finalize or get a good draft version of a conservation atlas ready that will indicate areas that could potentially be part of the marine protected areas process or the protected areas process. We're trying to determine right now through a legislative scan what would be the best fit. So this worksheet that's been provided is really relevant to our interests. And what we're trying to do is that we create a conservation atlas that can kind of inform the community consultation process that has to be undertaken as part of our Nunavik Inuit Land Claims Agreement before any protected areas or before any designations are created. And I'd like to also reassure the communities that whatever designation or whatever is decided, we would be keeping the community's interests in mind and the residents' views in mind before any determinations are made. And this process, as has been mentioned by DFO yesterday, is usually a pretty long process, but the idea is so that we can incorporate the community consultation period as appropriately as possible. And with that in mind as well, I want to reiterate as well that since the Nunavik Marine Region Planning Commission is undertaking the conservation atlas, it by no means that we're going to be deciding where those protected areas are. And those protected areas, when they're determined, would incorporate harvesting rights, of course, because that's part of our agreement and that's part of the impetus behind launching this. So with that in mind, I mean, I know there will be further discussions, and I think these discussions will be ongoing, but that's our input from our side. So if you're wondering what we're doing and want to be part of our process, please come see me at any time, and we can sit down and talk about it. Nakomi, thank you.
Stas and then Iola.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Jenny. I've got a question actually in respect to what you foresee happening should there be contradictory designations that are put into place by different groups. I mean here, for example, whether it would be an indigenous process through the institution of public government and perhaps something like a DFO designation that would be contradictory, number one. And number two, equally along that same vein, if there's a process that's been initiated earlier and then another one that's complementary could be done at a later time, it may prejudice the rights of a given organization or a landholder group in respect to the possibility of them wanting to develop something which is then prevented by the proposed listing or designation of a protected area, and as such prejudices those rights. So I just wanted to throw that into the mix, that that's a conundrum that, in fact, we're facing right now in respect to the process with Nunavut and their protected area or land use plan, which includes protected areas and which conflicts with the possibility of what Nunavik Inuit want to be doing. And secondly, their plan precedes what Nunavik is doing in terms of what Michelle was just speaking about, and may be contradictory.
Yeah, I think those are good questions to raise, and certainly things that will involve many conversations. And it sounds from what Cal was talking about that in the ISR they went with a working group model in terms of developing the protected areas, and certainly I think that example of a working group has worked well within Nunavik for other issues, like around the polar bear management plan, for example. And so maybe that's the model to continue to pursue for protected areas, ensuring that, Makivik would obviously be part of that working group, and maybe that's the forum for discussing making sure that those areas are not conflicting in terms of the type of protection that they're affording that area. Anyways, many conversations. Iola?
I just have a comment, not so much a question.
I'm just gonna say something what I want to say. For a long time, I'm regionally from Nunavut, and I was moved to Quebec in 1994. For those TFO, what they do, and Inuit never have an agreement fully. There always something power above, beyond to Inuit for their tradition. I'm really support for those particular lands that be protected. But mammals, I always got a question. Yes, if they were in the river, that's protected area. But if they move from that river, when they migrate, those are protected animals will go to not jurisdiction of the DFO. They won't wag the flag, I'm a protected, don't shoot me. They're not going to say that. So there should be something that agreement, not just from the one-sided. We should have an agreement between DFO and Inuit hunters. What I believe, we are Inuit, never ever extinguish animal in this world. We manage them. We know how to manage. But the new system, the management come to us. We don't understand it. I don't understand the quota system. My experience about the quota system, when they put the quota, everybody want to go hunt for beluga. Even those don't go hunt. Because there's limit. Before the quota system, maybe they'll caught one, enough for the family. And just recently, in Inuktitut, I live in Inuktitut, the beluga came to the town. And the town was caught for because they weren't waving the flag. I'm a protected. Didn't say it. So the hunters went there and fought. One day later, two people came with the guns and meet with us. Now I feel the guilty and criminal. So these other things are obstacles among us. I would like to see more woven together, shared together, put our knowledge into the system of DFO. We're not woven. We feel like an enemy each other by what we hear. In the meetings, there's the people doesn't really understand what we're talking about because we are living thousands of years. So I talked to officers there about the St. Lawrence River. They said, I said, our beluga go to St. Lawrence River in wintertime. So what he was told me, the fishermen was complained about they eating the fish. So the government would start action for it. They used the bomb to extinguish the beluga there with the bomb. And he said, now today we try to save them again. What the system, this is what we know, is we don't play around with our animals. We got, every bone's got the name into us. We know it. Maybe I'd like to suggest that we're allowed to go hunt to Long Island, that's from Inuit. If you could give us a fund to go to hunt, we won't touch the beluga there and protect it there. Because we have to pay from our pocket to go hunt. Machines, very expensive. Gas, very expensive. There's a beluga in front of us. This is not, we should really, like marine, protect it. It has to be something among to work together. This system is that I don't like. If we get 3, and they told us, you already got 30. This is 3 beluga, 30 killed. This is not right. So all the surveys done, and I would like to get a fund myself to start, do the work, and use our knowledge. So I'm not against your work, but I want more equalized. So we're not really equal what we hear because of survey being done, and we have to follow it, and it's very foreign to us. We never been educated about the system of the government of DFO in community level. All we know, if you pass a quota, you'll go to jail, they'll take your canoe, they'll take your rifle. Those are the things to us. We live here thousands of years. European just came yesterday. So, I'm sorry if something offends you, but I'm just saying what I see and to give out the voice. We need to settle between the government and community level. Nó không mệt.
I got Peter. Yeah. Thanks, Ayla. I certainly appreciate that Beluga and Nunavik is such a difficult topic, and while we don't necessarily have the time within this forum to talk about it, the board is in a consultation process and a public hearing process right now, and certainly Tommy and I would be very happy to discuss with you, because the whole part of that is to gather community feedback, as well as from the government and other stakeholders about how to improve beluga management. But to bring it back to protected areas, and I think protected areas might be a really powerful way for all of the different people, the rights holders and the stakeholders around the table to work together towards creating something that really upholds how Inuit and how Cree see those areas being used. So, Pita, did you want to speak?
Thank you very much. Well, we are in protected areas. I want to make a small or short comment on the protected areas. I want to see all the Belt Islands to be protected, or Sanikiluaq Islands, because there's a lot of beluga stocks came to Belcher Island in the springtime, like from Churchill, Western Hudson Bay belugas, Eastern, James Bay. Now we are beginning to know that I think we have a Belcher Island stock that stays all year round down there. So that's why I mentioned that I like to see the whole Belcher Islands be protected areas in terms of habitat of belugas. Thank you very much.
Just wanted to bring up something just about the word protected, and I think it's important that the word has different connotations, and it's really about what we've talked about maintaining the health of the ecosystem, and just as much of that is protecting the rights of Inuit and Cree to hunt in those areas as it is protecting the animals. It's not about stopping hunting. All the rights under the land claim agreements are guaranteed, and really it's about protecting those rights from outsiders coming in. So it's really, when we're talking about what a protected area is, I think it's really important to keep that in mind. It's really about protecting what's healthy. And in some ways, what's more important for some people about a protected area is less about the protection, because there's all different kinds of protected areas. And under Indigenous protected areas, the communities can decide what it is exactly that they want to protect. And the benefits are really about what comes with the capacity for long-term monitoring, the capacity to make sure that's healthy. And I think this is one of the big gaps for James Bay and Hudson Bay, is that there's no baseline data. We need to know more about these regions that we know from traditional knowledge are important, and it's a way to help keep these healthy in the long term. And so I think one of the big benefits, we've heard Peter say that large areas of the Belcher Islands should be protected. We've heard people here, we know the Cree are interested in protecting the large areas of eelgrass. And if people with those kind of comments, if there's possible to have a big Indigenous protected area that covers eelgrass, it covers Sanikiluaq, and we can show that Inuit and Cree from Nunavut and Nunavik want to work together to cover a protected area that covers all these different jurisdictions, and that we're willing to work together to make that happen. I think that's a really powerful statement that could come about what this consortium can do, and that it can be a model for showing how people can work together despite jurisdictions to keep the land healthy and to keep monitoring it. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Okay. Last point on protected area. By giving out my presentation yesterday, I tried to explain what really goes on in our bay. So I would want to say protected area or not, our community should be consulted if anything is going to be done within Hudson Bay or James Bay. That's very important because I tried to show everybody that we are at the receiving end, and having Nunavik Region Wildlife Board in our area, they should be consulted just the same if there's going to be anything happening, even at the Western Hudson Bay area. That's a very important point I want to make for everyone, especially your department, Caitlin. We should be consulted and should be informed and allow us to have our say if something is to be done, protected or not. Thank you.
Thanks, Shamik, and certainly this is very early, in Nunavik anyways, the conversations are at a very, very early stage, and community consultation would be one of the key elements to that process. I'm wondering if anyone from maybe Nunavut or Cree territory wanted to speak to the process, where the process is at in those areas. Matthew? Oh. Alan?
Could I just make a general point on the discussion around the concept of protection? There's an international consortium, as I'm sure you're aware, of dozens and dozens of indigenous peoples globally who've been working with this notion of indigenous protected areas. And they've really changed the language. So they now refer to themselves as the Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities Conserved Areas and Territories. And some of these groups are saying our entire traditional territory is a conserved territory. Within that, there may be nested, particular kinds of more particular protected areas. But I think that's more in keeping with the spirit of how Northern Indigenous people like to see their territories. It's the whole thing. It's not cutting pieces out for protection.
Alan? Thanks, Evan.
I'll try and chip into this discussion and offer a bit of a Cree perspective on this, and I hope I'm on point reasonably. I think it's, first of all, again, I come back to my presentation yesterday and the written text I produced, which contains a short section on protected areas, but we are still at a very early stage in the implementation of the EMR-LCA agreement. And there are provisions in that agreement which deal with the potential for the creation of protected areas, and it's a long and complex process, and it involves it involves governments which act as essentially the proponents of the initiative. Obviously, nothing's going to happen without close community involvement in that process. But ultimately, it's very important to understand the government role in the legislative framework for the creation of protected areas. we are interested in the concept, and as several people in this room know, we have initiated discussions, or we are involved in discussions with Park, specifically on the NMCA context, and we will be looking at developing a working relationship around the concept of a feasibility study for a protected area. And the feasibility study itself will serve as a framework for defining the areas involved, but also I think it is fair to say the relationship with the institutions created by the recent land claims agreements. I think it's also important to say that certainly in the Cree case, the offshore agreements were also inherited in some respects from the Nunavut model, but also influenced in other ways, but unspoken ways, by the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement. So the native parties, the indigenous parties to these agreements, find themselves feeling their way and exploring a number of really quite complex institutional issues which are not clearly articulated in the agreements themselves. All of this creates real challenges for working with individual communities, because we also have obligations for transparency and open communications with the communities, and we can't go to them without being able to be reasonably sure that we have adequate answers. Without adequate answers to these questions. So we're still very much, we're still at an early and exploratory stage. But I think it's also worth pointing out that the creation of protected areas has important implications for the implementation of the offshore agreement itself. The detailed workings of the wildlife management regimes and of the land use planning regimes also have to be aligned with the implications of the land use planning process itself. And I don't want to get into a great deal of it would be inappropriate for me to get into more detail about this right here, except to point out that we do have to work out these details with the government parties to the planning process, and with the regional indigenous government entity, the Cree Nation government, for which I work myself, but also with the communities. And so there are a lot of questions out there. Now, is this the question I'm asking myself as I listen to you? Is to what extent is this kind of experience relevant to the consortium? Are we working through an exercise here which in fact has relevance for the broader implications of protected areas planning further north? Possibly there is, in which case I think that the experience that we go through hopefully in the next 2 years, in 2017 and 2018, will in fact help shape the kind of relationships with communities that is relevant to the consortium. I don't know, but we're open to suggestions on that front, and I think that as I return from this meeting, I will be raising this kind of question with the regional entity that I work for. But I think that what I'm really trying to say, and I try to say this in the text that I produced for this meeting, is that there's a lot of hidden administrative and institutional complexity in the tailoring and implementation of these offshore agreements, and they have to be looked at in ways which make sense for coastal communities. We're not necessarily there yet, but a very important part of the challenge lying ahead right now is to make the planning process, or the decision-making process, accessible and relevant at a community level. And I think for me, the interest of the consortium concept is that it provides a framework for discussing with communities what kind of role they want to play and what they need to know about this, the institutional challenges involved in trying to make these land claim settlements work. There are a lot of issues there. You know, we tend to go into these agreements as though they settle issues and that somehow we've resolved the problem of Aboriginal land claims. But in other ways, from my own perspective anyway, we open up all sorts of doors which now need to be addressed. And part of the challenges we on the Cree side face is trying to figure out where those doors are and where they lead and what kind of questions, what kind of issues we now need to address. Now, if the consortium concept can provide a framework for exploring these kind of issues with other communities, so much the better. And I think that the Cree experience moving into their own implementation phase can help inform that kind of discussion. So I hope that that's relevant, but that's my feedback to you, Caitlin.
Thanks, Alan. I think that helps to highlight some of the significant complexities in kind of navigating these conversations. Chris, did you want to speak?
Thanks, Alan. I certainly don't purport to speak for Indigenous peoples or any Indigenous organization, but certainly from my perspective, it occurs to me that whether you're talking about Inuvialuit, Nunatsiavut, Nunavut, Nunavik, there's a common theme in all of those settled land claim agreements, and it's that, and again, from my perspective, that there is some unfinished business in the marine in particular. And that it's something that, well, there's another common theme, and it's that the federal government has retained far more significant management powers in the marine, and has been, throughout those processes, for whatever reason, more comfortable to create management bodies, Indigenous management bodies and co-management bodies on land. And that's, of course, a strange paradox when we're talking about so many communities and peoples who are inherently very involved in the marine environment. And so I kind of see it as unfinished business of the land claims processes. And when I think about marine protection, I think about this as one avenue, one opportunity, not for creating just sort of floating parks, but for allowing communities formally back into a conversation with federal agencies to provide for local management of those ocean and sea resources. And so I would encourage organizations at this table to think, I guess, really broadly and expansively of what marine protection means and what it might mean, and the kind of roles and responsibilities beyond just the sort of the classical view of what of a marine protected area, and so think about transportation implications, fishing, hunting. In addition, the kind of conflicts we've seen in the Beaufort and in Nunavut surrounding seismic and oil and gas, a lot of those come from, again, in my opinion, the fact that that this part of many of the land claim processes are not finished, and there's still a lot of work to do, and so I see this interest in marine protection as an area in which we should be thinking not just about sort of very narrow view of ocean management, but in relation to all of these other ways that we need to take care of major decisions that impact communities and the sea around them. Thanks.
Thanks. Elon, did you want to have the final word?
Well, can I just...
Yeah, on protected areas. We have a long tradition to go out on a walrus hunting expedition by Peterhead boat. It's our long traditionally, we've been told that there'll be an increase on shipping lanes in what's that, Hudson Strait. We're concerned with the walrus, how do you say it, basking areas in the islands. Maybe because of the increase of shipping, they'll probably, in the future, probably will affect, and as consequences, the walrus will probably migrate back to where they once before in our shores, to Hudson area. But when a walrus is seen in our hunting area on ice floe, the ring seals disappear. And we don't like that. We'd rather have ring seals than walrus. And because it's already been foretold that walrus will come back, that we might not have ring seals if the walrus comes in. And we'd rather have ring seals as our diet than have walrus. So therefore, I'm proposing and wrote down that Nottingham Islands and Salisbury Islands be protected against the increase of ships passing through. Does that make sense? Thank you.
Nakumik Eli. Yes.
Caitlin?
Alan.
Can I just follow up on something I wanted to say just now, and that is that I think that one of the themes that you may want to explore as you talk about protected areas is a source of institutional support for the consortium itself, because there are resources. This is a government process. There are government resources which are not tied up directly in the land claim settlement implementation process, which can help provide some of the framework needed in order to improve baseline knowledge and conduct research within segments of the northern coastline of Hudson Bay and James Bay. So I think you should keep in mind the possibility that the implementation process for feasibility studies and for subsequent implementation can help provide some of the core funding needed to maintain the linkages between communities. So that I see a link at that level which is worth exploring.
Thanks, Alan. So thanks to everyone around the table. A quick reminder to feel free, the maps can stay up for the rest of the day, so feel free to come up and mark down areas that you're interested in talking about. Certainly nothing on those maps serves as something that's permanent, but it's really a conversation starter. And as Chris indicated, the land claims certainly in the offshore areas for in the Nunavik Marine Region and the EU Marine Region are relatively young, and the conversations and about how to navigate through implementing that is an ongoing conversation that needs to continue between the rights holders, the co-management partners, and the institutions of public government. So thanks for being part of some of the early phases of those discussions today. Nakumik.
I was wondering if we could revisit the protected areas thing, just kind of briefly, summarizing some of what we've heard from different people. I think the protected areas side of things is a really important outcome of the meeting. And so I'm just going to throw this out there. We've heard that, Cree are interested in protecting eelgrass all the way up the coast. We've heard that people are interested in protecting the Belcher Islands up to the Sleepers, and we've heard about the Ottawa Islands. So we heard a lot in that whole session about how the different regions are going to have to go through a process for their jurisdiction. And for those overlap areas, obviously that's a little bit more complicated. But I'm wondering what people think about as a starting point. What about if we considered everyone thinking about a large protected area, a network of protected areas, if you will, that covers this whole large region from the eelgrass up to the Belchers, up to the Sleepers. And we can say as an outcome that it could be an Indigenous protected area, which allows people to basically come up with their own way of thinking about how these would be managed, how to keep these ecosystems healthy. Within those regions, there could be more specific areas that people want to see marine protected areas with more formal government designation. But I think the idea that if we could come away from this meeting thinking that we're interested to work together to provide stewardship for a large area that covers Cree territory, that covers Nunavik territory, that covers Nunavut territory and their overlaps, and to think about working together for that stewardship, even if they have to be pieces that are figured out by the different regions, but it's a network of protected areas. The biggest benefit that's going to come from that, even more than the protection in the long term, might even be just the capacity to understand what are the gaps for those areas, to set up monitoring. Because with the protected areas process comes funding for evaluating what's going on in those areas. There's funding for setting up research to identify some of the gaps in research and the priorities that people have identified. So I don't know if anyone wants to go to the map. We could just draw a giant area over all of James Bay and Southeast Hudson Bay as a starting point and work backwards. What do people think about this idea of agreeing to move forward and think about a large protected area that demonstrates that Inuit and Cree from Nunavut and Nunavik and EU are willing to work together to think about protected areas? Just going to throw that out there. It'd be great to hear what people think.
Right now.
Make a wall.
Yeah. We'll see him now. Shower's not. There's the map right there. Show up putting them up, eh?
Maybe just a lack of understanding, I think. Is that I thought the marine protected area is supposed to be recommended by the communities. It's not. When I thought are these federal protected areas, not communities? Because I thought all the marine protected areas supposed to be recommended by the community and applied to DFO for approval. Is that how the process works? Or I don't know. I don't really know. And at the same time, how are these going to apply to the land use plan?
Alan, can we get a mic to the back there?
Am I on? Yes, you are. I think you make an interesting point, Joe, but I think it's also important I think it's important also to try and maintain a clear focus on what you are looking for under the heading of a protected area. I think that the process that the process that I referred to earlier on, and I think that is also contemplated by the MPA, or the Marine Protected Area concept, provides a framework within which we can focus in on more specific areas or more specific environments which justify protective measures. But I think you have to really think through the question of what do you want to accomplish by creating protected areas. You can define the area broadly, You can define your search broadly, but I think you need to be prepared to focus more specifically on what it is precisely you want to accomplish and what kind of resources are needed for that purpose. So there's a sort of cascade of different geographical scales involved.
Yeah, so would that be eelgrass up the coast and important plinias and bird areas on the Belchers, important beluga habitat? So I'm thinking like we can start from a big area and work backwards. Where are the specific areas that really need focus, and how do we create that as a network that goes across? So I mean, I think each of the different regions have their own processes for protected areas. So I'm just trying to focus the conversation a little bit on the interjurisdictional part of that. Do we think about a protected area that is in the overlap agreement area, or that crosses over between two different areas? Or even if it's like separate ones that are created in the different areas, how do we approach this as networking them together and the connection between those protected areas potentially having a greater impact than just a bunch of individual ones? So I'm just kind of wondering, like, I don't know if people in Shasby, what do you think about eelgrass protected area? I've heard people talk about that a little bit before. Do you think it would be important to connect that to other areas, or is that something you're interested to talk about? Or?
I guess one of the issues we have is we should protect areas that have not been affected or altered. Eelgrass has been affected dramatically. So should we protect what's there in the state that it is and have maybe no recourse to the damage or to those people that caused the damage or the source of the damage because it's protected? So we're still not sure about that. If the eelgrass was healthy and before the impacts, I think we'd have no problem saying, let's protect it. Let's create a protected area for the eelgrass. But now it's been heavily impacted. What would we be protecting, I guess, is our question. And why would we be protecting it? I think it's a little too late for some of these.
I don't know if some of the protected areas, people want to speak to that. Like, is it, I mean, the ecosystems change. Is it necessary for a protected area to say this is how it is now and we're protecting it? I mean, one thing I would say about that is it's not just about the protection, it's about it would provide a network of monitoring to try and see how that's going to continue to change. Is it going to get it worse? And that capacity to understand and evaluate the current state of the ecosystem and to monitor it over time to see how it's going to change is a real benefit, maybe even more than the protection side of it. But I wonder if some of the protected areas folks out there know, like if there's an area that's important, it's been impacted somewhat, by setting up a protected area, does that mean that you have to protect where it was half broken, or does it mean that you can use that to help try and restore it to its original state?
Hi. Got a question on the grass. It's been affecting us for a long time now. Since they started the James Bay project, it's been going down, and we have to change our ways of hunting geese in our territories. And I think that's all the way to the tip of the Quebec, province of Quebec, all the way. It's been changing how do we hunt geese and everything. And even the Arctic char for the I think it's because of the eelgrass. It's been affecting our ways of hunting. We have to find new ways of hunting and hawking. I think it's because the hydro projects and everything. Why shouldn't they help us?
Thank you. Cal, you were going to say something?
Yeah, the question of, if something's been impacted and whether or not a marine protected area is of value at that point, and I think it is a very good point, and to ask that question. And I know internally we have that discussion too, in some of the areas that we're looking at that may have been impacted. And Joel, your comment about, it's an opportunity, I think, to bring some resources to bear on an issue. But I think also when we're looking at potential sites, this gets to the question, and I think Chris had brought it up earlier and a few others, you really have to look at the tool that is going to be used, because in this situation with the eelgrass, an Oceans Act MPA may not be able to affect some of the things that are actually impacting, or whatever tool you use, it really needs to fit what the impact or activities that are causing the problem. So just a caution in terms of what's being chosen.
So if it was an indigenous protected area, there might be more flexibility in determining what it meant to be protection, whether it meant current state versus historical state, potentially. Yeah. Hi.
I might slightly contradict Cal, but it seems to me marine protected areas are a tool to get you somewhere, and I think what you have to look at is what are the overall values that you want to protect in Hudson's Bay and James Bay, and marine protected areas might be one of those tools, and there may be a number of different values, ecological values, cultural values that you want to include as part of the things that maybe the best tool is some kind of protected area, but it might be a different tool. But it also really comes back to the point I was trying to make earlier, that I think you need to put this within the overall vision of what you're all trying to achieve together through the consortium. And marine protected areas and marine protected area networks are one tool to help you achieve that. And I think you need to think first about what you want to achieve rather than worrying first about the tool. To me, there's lots of opportunities to design tools to help you achieve what you want to achieve. And I wouldn't start with the constraint of, okay, well, this is the legislation and this is what it allows you to do, because I've seen lots of flexibility if you can come up with a good rationale to achieve your goals and your vision. But I do think you still need to put this overall within a framework for what you're doing overall for Hudson's Bay, and how do MPAs or an MPA network help you get there. So it seems like you're jumping too far, too quickly into that piece. I do think there's an opportunity to look at what are the areas with strong ecological values, in cultural values in Hudson's Bay and James Bay, and try to put that together. And look at then what are the best mechanisms to use.
For the record, I agree with what Sabine said. I mean, your objectives and obviously your values are a starting point. It's just when you get to that point of looking at various tools, then that's a decision that has to be made.
Yeah, so is wanting healthy ecosystems and monitoring is the tool, protected areas, to help make that happen, I guess. Is kind of the conversation, and it seems like it's a very good one, especially given the current mandates as well. But maybe there's some, I think the dialogue of what type of protected area that would be is a really important part of that as well. Yeah. Tommy.
Hello. Yeah, I'm just curious. With the marine protected areas, who's actually going to enforce the protection? Who's going to regulate the protected areas? I'm just curious.
That question was to someone else, not me, I'm pretty sure.
it depends on many different things. And I mean, it can depend on whether, you know, there is a federal agency involved, but I mean, I would say a key part of this is local community engagement in enforcing and monitoring these areas. And then, you know, in order to get to that point, then you will need resources to do that kind of thing, obviously. But it's a long, there's a much longer answer that I don't think we have time for today, but, you know, it really does depend.
Alan?
Well, I just want to make the remark that the protected areas are products of federal legislative initiatives and responsibility. They do require resources from the federal government, and there are different statutes depending on the department that's involved, so that perhaps I would be inclined to respond to the discussion in the last few minutes by saying that we have no choice, that we do need to look at the different kinds of tools and what they can accomplish and who's going to be responsible for them. Because if we pursue this discussion and this analysis, there are certain numbers of things that can be done at the initiative of coastal communities and their regional organizations, but ultimately you will be turning to the sources of authority for the federal legislation which creates these protected areas. And there's a big difference, I believe, between an MPA or marine protected area and a marine conservation area. It gets complicated, and I've been reminded myself that I don't necessarily understand all the details there. But you have to understand the complex government processes involved in creating these entities, and even eventually in uncreating them as well. And there are important differences between a marine protected area and a marine conservation area. It all sounds kind of esoteric, but these are very important practical issues when you look at this from the perspective of the federal government agencies. And I'm not speaking for them, but I'm saying that you have to take that into account.
Chris or Jenny, do you guys have some context for the Indigenous protected areas and Mary Simon's Arctic leadership model? Like, how would that be different in that context if that actually is legislated?
So the Indigenous protected area is a term I think that Mary Simon and others are borrowing from other examples in other parts of the world, notably some interesting things in New Zealand and in Australia. In that context, and what's interesting about the Australian model is that it's really a community-driven process, so the designations come from Indigenous communities, and interestingly, there's no legislation that accompanies them. So it's a completely different model than what we have in Canada. And what's attractive about it is it really is a bottom-up approach. I guess echoing some of the other concerns I'm hearing in the room, I think, and maybe just a continuation of my earlier thought, I think that it's really important to remember that, you know, a designation in and of itself doesn't actually change anything about the waters around you, right? I mean, calling something a marine protected area doesn't necessarily make it more protected. It's the activities that go on inside of it, and it's the activities that potentially flow from some of these designations, I think, that are really critical to think about. And so what I would, again, I guess, encourage us to think about is in terms of contemplating whatever vehicles communities want or don't want in terms of for creating marine protected areas. They first think about, you know, what are the ways that they want to use to perhaps sustainably develop and to protect in those waters before, I think, falling into the concern about which box to sort of place over those waters.
Caitlin?
I'm not sure who best to direct this question to, but I'm wondering, whether, and since I think Joel's right, for some of the benefits would be in the ongoing activities associated with the protected areas and whether that would allow for monitoring of those areas. And I'm wondering how the funding differs between the different tools or types of protection. I don't know if somebody from the federal government maybe is best positioned to answer that, but whether, so a land, protected area is created through a lands claim process versus through the process that Mary Simon's leading versus through DFO or Parks Canada or Environment Canada. Is there the funding model that comes with that in terms of having resources for an office in the north in terms of ongoing monitoring programs? Do they differ between those different tools? And if so, how?
I'll let Cal answer that, and then we have a question from Henry and Eli.
Sure, I'll speak from the DFO perspective, but it has, again, for us in the Arctic, it's really one that's been in place, and we're about to have another one, and the funding has changed over time, and it does support the administrative aspect of it, monitoring activities, management activities. We also have traditional knowledge capacity that's been built into it as well. So it's not a strict model. We're trying to get there. One of the things that we are, and we have to do under the Nunavut claim, is the Inuit Impact Benefit Agreements. So that will, as we go forward with our partners in Nunavut, that will be a key aspect of any protected areas that are developed in Nunavut and elsewhere, we expect.
So they come with benefit agreements. Henry and then Eli. Sorry, I missed you guys.
Okay, thank you. Protected areas are a really good idea, helping each other through this consortium. But we have agreement in principle in place also, which makes it kind of hard to talk about protected areas through this consortium because we have it in place we have to go to the people in the communities with our agreement, and we have to go back to the communities first and then work with the federal government. So we're kind of yes and no on this because with our agreement we have to work with the people up north for the protected areas and go back to the federal government with our proposal. So I don't know. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think we've heard sometimes that can be almost a 10-year process as well. And I think what we're trying to figure out here maybe is like, what are the tools? And so what should we take back to the communities to help start this process to better understand that in the context? But I think that point, and what a few other people said, having this come from the bottom up and come from the communities is really important. So if we can figure out the tools that'll work in this context, it could be really important. Eli?
I think we should expand our minds a little bit. It's not just protection programs, study programs. There can also be recovery programs, cultivating programs. I want to advise the Crees, if they have a diminishing eelgrass, maybe there could be some kind of recovery program. Maybe we should apply also a recovery program at the same time and discuss protected areas. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Chris, then Alan. Or Alan, then Chris, either way.
Yeah. I just wanted to, it's maybe a little bit off topic, but I'd like to make the point that the land claim settlements around the region we're talking about, Nilka, EMI, and Nunavut further north, as far as I know, all contain provisions dealing with the federal responsibility for environmental monitoring. Maybe there's not a great deal of testing of what this means in practice. Ryan Barry might be able to help us out in this discussion, but there are provisions in the land claim settlements which could be invoked in support of the strengthening of the capacity of communities to engage in monitoring and improved baseline data around the region. And that's, if you like, complementary to the discussion you've been having this afternoon about protected areas.
Chris, do you still have a comment there?
Yeah, just a continuation of Eli's point in some ways. I think that one of the greatest appeals, attractions for really kind of investigating at a local and regional and land claim organization level of engaging in some kind of marine management, marine protection is not only the economic benefits that might flow very simply from one of those mechanisms, the traditional federal mechanisms we're talking about, but all of the other ways that we, and almost always at this point, the federal government manages our oceans. So I just, as Eli was talking, I made a list here. So, you know, spill response. Where's that capacity in communities right now? Probably non-existent. All kinds of monitoring, everything from environmental assessments. I'm sure Hydro-Quebec has significant commitments, at least in the near shore, in terms of boats going out and testing. Who's doing that work? I bet a lot of it goes to environmental engineering companies. Search and rescue. Many people in northern jurisdictions have tremendous experience with that. A lot of that's volunteer. How much maritime search and rescue is organized in communities? Probably not enough. I've personally been in situations where people are waiting for a Hercules coming from the East Coast all the way to the high Arctic. Hydrographic studies. The Hydrographic Service has, we've all, anyone who's spent time on the water in the north knows how limited that mapping is presently. I know that the Canadian Hydrographic Service is actively contemplating outsourcing some of those roles to boats smaller than the Coast Guard ships that have created a lot of the maps that are just thin transects. Harvesting issues, I mean, the list goes on. And so I think that there are tremendous opportunities to engage very constructively with a federal government right now that is open to these issues, that it's appointed, for instance, Mary Simon to look at these things in terms of sharing those responsibilities, or in some cases devolving some of those maritime responsibilities. And so I see this as a tremendous opportunity.
So in some ways it sounds like it's actually putting these tools back in the hands of communities and less under federal control. That's really interesting. Ella, did you have a question?
You would say something about mining it.
There's probably somebody that can translate. I'm a Cree, and that's the only language that I can speak. I'd like to thank everybody that's here in this community for the reason that we're here. We have the full effects of since we had the Hydro-Quebec Dam, and we're very the Cree and the Inuit are the ones that are affected by what's happening. For the fishermen, the hunters, the birds are gone, the eelgrass is gone, and the geese are gone with. I just want to relay that to you. It is true what we're telling, and ever since we had these stands and everything that was thrown under the water has virtually disappeared. We, the elders, noticed that, and we've seen how we have hunted in the past, and this is the geese are gone, including the other birds, and they cannot be here because there's nothing for them to eat. And everybody is, when you go anywhere where there's best food, that's where we go. It's the same with the migratory birds, because there's nothing. That's what we've lost, and we've lost our geese and our birds. And this is what the decree had depended on. And because people have always relied on the traditional food, and ever since we had this project, and this is what I wanted to tell you. And this is how we are affected. Ever since we've had the project, and how much it has affected the sea ice. I've hunted both inland and on the coastal areas. It's just like the Inuit. We have depended on the ice for our seal hunting, and we've had snow. We've relied on dog teams and our. And this is what we have come across in our livelihoods. What we have seen, we are the witnesses to what has existed before and what is here now. And this is what we've. I think there's about seven dams that are affecting us. And we're very, very sure that this all come from Hydro-Quebec, and everything that has been affected is on the account of what has been done to our river. This is what I wanted to tell you, what I'm telling you now. We've lost a lot of things, and the most affected was the migratory birds. And almost every kind of animals. And this is what what I wanted to tell you. And I'm very happy that you have chosen our community to talk about the issues that we face in our community, so that you might be able to help us to. Try to help us resolve some of our both Cree and non-Cree. I consider you as our brothers.
Thank you. Yelak, did you have a question? Did you want to say something?
Nakumik. Thank you. I think it was yesterday there was a scientist was speaking about for evidence. If you're going to do a lawsuit for the government or organization, should have evidence of scientists. I think we could stand up and try to get compensate for those we already lost. Regards to hydro dam or something or mining. I think there seems to be nobody really concrete based on what we already lost from what we have, what we try to preserve. I think we should work together and do something about it. Those already we lost. We should do something about that. We're not going to work for nothing, and nobody else going to do an action for it. We give out our treasures, what we think. The work what we've done is have to gonna go somewhere. I think we should put some concrete that for those we already lost, how we gonna get it back. Nakomi.
Hello. Bajia.
Hello.
Why bak? Hatun sa ano ibig day miya.
As soon as everybody is taking their seat, then I'll start speaking.
I'll wait till everybody is seated. You might fall down after you've heard what I'm going to be speaking about. Just kidding.
I don't know, you can go in the march, it's scary now too. Scary.
Sasa, look. Okay?
It's scary now.
Look and see.
I don't like to go slush. Yeah. Boy.
Okay, look and see. Sasa.
Are you ready, Lucas?
Okay, I just wanted to share something that came to me as I listened to the presentations that have been made over the last 2 days. And I can sense some frustration of some of the speakers. But I was reminded of a very similar situation, I guess you can call it, that I became involved in the early stages of it, and it has to do with the decline of the caribou within the province of Quebec. And this brought the different groups from different jurisdictions to address that situation. And I wanted to share some of the stuff that I've learned from my involvement with that particular group. One interesting thing that I have learned, I want to thank John for bringing that word up, the word stakeholders. I think we should remember that phrase that John has suggested, because we are the right holders. It's all the Aboriginal people around this table. We are the right holders of the territory we call Hudson Bay. So when we ever use those terms, I think we need to use that word, right holders, because that's what we are. It was given to us right from before contact. And there's a very big responsibility that was given to us with that, and we need to recognize it. What I wanted to share with you is I'm still not completely certain what role this table will be playing. As there's so many different things that have been discussed, and all these things are very important. But I think what we need, what's required is some kind of a coordination. And before we're too far ahead of ourselves in the discussion, all the wonderful discussions that have been going on, we need to step back a bit and try to understand what it is we need to do. I think the most important thing, because I want to thank Eli for that. I don't know whether he was serious or stoking around, and he said that he needed to be convinced that the Crees were interested in the coastline, and that the Crees were not only interested in the inland. But that brought me to this, to what I wanted to share with you today because of that. I think the important thing and first thing that we need to do is agree on what we need to do in the future. And the way to do that was perhaps to develop a statement that will guide us and keep us focused on what we think this table should be doing. So every time we get lost, we just come back and remind ourselves of the statement that we will agree on. When the original statement that I'm going to share with you, when it was first developed, it was shared among all the groups that were part of that round table. And it was only released after, when everybody agreed to the content of that statement. It's not a very long statement, but it is a statement that comes from the Aboriginal, from an Aboriginal perspective. There's been discussions, and there's truth in that the Cree have a very different perspective of wildlife management than the scientific community. That doesn't mean that we can't find ways of working together towards a common goal. The last 2 days, what I've been hearing is that has to be a priority, that the right holders continue to enjoy what is left of the resources of the Hudson Bay and James Bay. And I think we can start from there. And I'm going to share this. This is just an example of something that perhaps we can develop. And I might suggest that from each group, you appoint someone, maybe a small group, to work on that statement. And start with it and circulate it so that everybody can look at it and have a final statement later on. The other thing that happened once when the roundtable got going was there was a press release to inform the public of what that roundtable was about and what they were planning to do. Maybe that's another thing that can be looked at later on, once we have agreed. So this is a statement that came from that roundtable. It says, intimate relationship with the land is a dimension far from being a mythical one, but certainly real, present, and essential to the physical, mental, and spiritual well-being of an individual and a society as a whole. For thousands of years, we have depended on the land and lived within the natural cycles of life. Understanding and respect of the land and animals was and is fundamental for our survival. Respect for animal is an important component throughout the process of hunting and the life of a hunter. It is shown in many ways, but most importantly, respect is shown by sharing, harvesting only what is needed and what the population can handle, and ensuring that all parts of an animal are used. These principles are the foundation for our use and management of the land. That's the statement. So perhaps that's what I want to share with you. If people agree that we can work on something like that, that is relevant to the marine region, that's probably a very good starting point that will guide us throughout the years as we go along trying to get this forum going. That's all I wanted to share. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to speak my language. I am comfortable for my language. Makoni.
I have two points from our land, from Iwuyivik area. I'm from Iwuyivik. The one of the islands have no more gulls situated there because of the airplane flights over the island. That has been affected because the plane route has to be looked at. We've relayed this concern to the airlines, but nothing has been done. We don't eat the seagulls, but they are still animals. They have been put aside by the noise of the plane because their nesting area has been affected by the plane, and it was very painful to see that the island has no more life. It's about 4 miles from Iwuyivik, an island, and the plane we feel need to reroute. And we also have a lake that has MERS. And in the month of June and July, we would hope that the plane don't pass by so much around that area because lots of people are falling and killing themselves from shock of the sound of the plane. We need to have this looked at for the animals. So I wanted to share this with you because I'm talking about the two birds, the MERS and the seagull. In the month of June and July, we would hope that the routing of the plane would be changed. Thank you.
Eli, you had something to say?
In response to my brother there from a Cree site, when I did my opening remarks, I was just joking. I wasn't serious. And I would rather have Crees have a management plan in order to, in the future, exploit the goods and bounties of the sea. So don't worry. I'm convinced the Crees should have their own management plan. Okay? Don't worry about it. We need you guys too.
Hello. Agad na, Adja.
I just wanted to say for these 2 days that we've sat here, I've heard a lot of things that we've talked about, but I don't exactly know how we're going to be approaching this and how we're going to work on this. And also, I won't talk for too long. I just wanted to say that I've heard a lot of people from Chisasibi talk about the effects that they've felt ever since we had this Hydro-Quebec project, because they're the ones that are downstream from the project, and how much they felt, and also that we are north from here, and also it's almost as if we're feeling some of the effects too, and also the ice that is out in the sea, and also the animals, including sea and land, and those that fly. We feel the effects for those that are north from this community. And ever since we had this river dammed, then we've noticed that ever since we've had this, and we have a lot of rain. For example, we have strong winds, and also we have big blizzards. And that's how I know that some of these things that are different, we feel the effects. And also this especially this month, we already had snow on the ground around this time. Those who have been here for many years, we've seen now that we don't have any snow in the ground anymore. Yes, things are starting to change from what was what happened before we had the dams, and also Hydro-Quebec that have affected the animals. Some of things that we have, the spin-offs, the economic spin-offs. We also feel the positive side of it, but also and that's some of the things that we have seen. Yes, some things are negative for us, but also some things are positive. Ever since we had this agreement signed in 1975, I don't particularly like it, but and we talk about the things that are in the water. Yes, I'm hoping that things will be different in a positive way, and also, and there was a ship that was bound for was Webmaxtui, and it sank out in the bay, and I've never really heard anything how we can retrieve some of those things that sank, and there were some things that that were floated on the water, and people that went out to go hunting, they saw some of these supplies that were that had sank but that floated up. But there's and I need a Spanish-speaking translator here. And also I thank you, and I hope every one of you make their way home safely.
Thank you very much. I think we should get back to the structure talk as well, Isaac. That was a really amazing statement. We've heard about kind of developing the terms of reference or developing the vision or the guiding principles for the consortium, and we've had some ideas, and I think there's been a lot of shared things, and so I'd be open to people's approach. We have people that are on this planning steering committee. It's not official steering committee yet because we're not actually official. We're still in the planning stages. But if the suggestion, your approach about a group of people to work on that and then to send it out with the members and then that could be taken to the communities, I think that's an approach that we could do. And I would encourage people, like there's about a dozen people on the steering committee so far. Some of those are from West Hudson Bay. But anyone that wants to be involved in that initial stages of that kind of a discussion, that you can join the steering committee. It doesn't have to be any sort of official commitment. At this stage, it's still a planning steering committee, so it's informal. So if you're not on our planning steering committee, please let us know, and we can, I think that's a really important discussion to have, to come up with that kind of vision statement. And then to take that back to the communities for the consultation, like we've heard, and to try and have something that a year from now, when we meet again, that people can say, yes, this is the statement that we've all agreed on, that can guide kind of where we go so we can keep things moving ahead.